All right, sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you for the reminder, Leanne. And I did want to remind people that this is recording, and you think I would have remembered that when I was just referring to all those recordings that are sitting on the site, but I didn't. So again, welcome, and today we're going to talk a little bit, and I'll go back a slide because I didn't start the recording, so people will miss my slide if they're watching the recording. So like I said, we are going to talk today about the output of elementary literacy. The other sessions we've talked about students and how they're going to take in information through some skills that develop their reading, and then we're going to connect those skills and into their writing. So last summer, we had about 60 teachers that worked together, and they did some revisions on the main learning results, and they kind of came up to their own description of what they think of as writing. And remember, this is a definition that main teachers, your coworkers, came up with. And so they defined writing as a lifelong essential tool for communication. They talked about the importance that students should write routinely and to build stamina, and that they should write across all disciplines, and that all the parts of writing are important, including their handwriting and communication and their task, audience, and purpose. So this is the current provisionally adopted lead into, they call it a preamble in writing, and it's currently sitting on the main ELA webpage under the revised standards information. And this was how, after a lot of days together and a lot of talking, main teachers really decided that we should think of our main students when we think of writers. So the most important part when we think about writing is that ultimately it is a tool for communication. And I really liked the little cartoon over there, the little Snoopy cartoon on the side. And if you've ever, years ago when I used to do scored writing with the MEA, or just scoring writing prompts in schools, if you've ever sat and done those, sometimes kids want to get to the bottom of a page. And so you read more than one paper at the end where they write things like, and it was very, 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 very good. Or, you know, they write the end in really big letters. So then it becomes a little bit more about filling in space and a little less about tools of communications. So over the, the experiences that we've had when we talk with employers and we talk about the needs of our workforce, they often identify communication as their most important skill that they're looking for when they're looking to hire people to fill their jobs. They want people who can communicate, and they want them who can communicate orally and in print. And so our task, if you will, is to really think about how we can support students in using writing to convey information. And that is all kinds of writing. It's messages, instructions, letters, directions, all kinds of things, and they all have value and are important when we're thinking about really building communication and skills as for our writers as we go through. I did also want to remind people that if you have any questions and anything that comes up for a thought or a question, Leanne Larson is here, and she is monitoring that chat room. So she will be, if you have questions or comments or reflections as we go along, please feel free to enter those in the chat room. Again, be thinking about how important writing is as a tool. So one of the most difficult things when we're thinking about our writers is how we're going to be building writing stamina, how we can really get our students to be strong writers. And when we think about writing stamina, it's kind of that definition of really getting students to be able to focus and write without giving up or being, too tired or avoiding this task. Usually writing stamina becomes stronger and more consistent as the foundational physical act of writing becomes a little less taxing for them. When students are putting a lot of energy into those other skills like how to form letters or how to sound out words, it's much harder to keep an idea in their minds to keep that over a period of time. So the more those foundational skills become strong, we hope that we see an increase in their abilities and for their writing stamina. It's also important when we're thinking about writing and we think about that definition that our main teachers wrote, is we want to think about writing across all the disciplines and giving lots of opportunities for writing, because you never know what's really going to spark the student's interest when it comes to getting that writing down, what really might, engage them to write. They might not be interested in writing a story. They might not think they have anything to say, but they might be very interested in writing their observations or their reflections about something they see in nature, or responding to something that they've done an experiment on, or writing an argument. A lot of times, some of our students who can't think of anything to write often have a lot to say, and maybe they have the argument there that they could write from. So, think about different places where you can write and give them a chance to express their ideas, or maybe give a rationale, or, really help them narrow things so that as they're going through in all of our content areas. So then we think about the tools and processes of writing. When we think about that definition and we go back to that, we also think about all of those foundational things and all the other parts of writing that we instruct. We think about their spelling and word choice, organization, their grammar, and then, the conventions of writing, the legibility of writing, and all of those things come in across as parts of what we're instructing when we're instructing for the task of writing. One really important thing to keep in mind is that when we're writing and we're getting our students to engage in the act of communication through print, we really want to keep in mind that students must know and really have a constant idea that writing for task and audience is really important. It's important that students know that there's a purpose for their writing. A lot of times they'll see it as they'll be disengaged or not motivated if they don't see what the purpose is for that. Another important thing for them to sort out is what are they trying to communicate through their writing? What type of what writing is this for? What is their message going to be? The audience for who they're writing is geared for. Is it, it's a self-reflection. It might not always be a public audience. It might be for themselves. It might be for the teacher. But sometimes those students who struggle with writing, they don't know that anything is going to happen with it. They see it as kind of a futile effort since it might not go anywhere. So giving them a purpose and a task to communicate, but then an appropriate audience for who that might go to. And then as when we're thinking about writing and we're working with students for writing, we can give them those guidances so that we can help them make those choices and really give them a focus. So when we think of our struggling writers, I'm sure a lot of you that work in small groups or work to support students in whether it's in Title I or in the classroom or in special ed, I'm sure a lot of you are seeing students who are really struggling with the task of writing. So, there's the foundational pieces, which are the pieces we talked about in the other sessions, whether it's the spelling or the physical act of writing, those things, that's one level. But the other things that really kind of break, you kind of look back, take a step back and formatively assess students is really where is the struggle falling for your students as writers? Is it students who are struggling with an idea? Are there students who say things like, oh, I don't know what to write about. I don't have anything to say. I don't know. Or is it students who are struggling with the organizational piece? I don't know how to start. Or they write a little bit and they say, I'm done. Or you might look back at their piece and it might have lots of good information, but it doesn't make any sense. It's to the top, it's to the bottom. It's very, is it very hard for you to follow? And so it's an organization issue. Or is it that motivation, refusal, and disengagement? Is it the student who says things like, I can't, oh, this is dumb, I hate writing? A lot of times those are the students who even if they had an idea, they're going to avoid writing to the very best of their ability. So when we think about, kind of addressing the struggling writer and supporting a student, one thing you want to think about is where is the breakdown for your student that you're working with? Where is the struggle for writing for them? Because they can't attack all of these things at one time. That's just too much for them to process. So is it that, it's going to be working on those foundational skills? Is it a student who needs help formulating ideas? Is it a student who needs help organizing? Is it a student who's lacking motivation and stamina, and they need some scaffolding for that? So when we go through, we're going to try to think through some of those processes and how we might make some decisions around that. That doesn't quit. So when we think about supporting our writers, the What Works Clearinghouse has a lot of information where they kind of do, they kind of break down different strategies and different instruction into what's the, moderate effectiveness or highly effective recommendations for them. And so in 2018, they came up with a list of kind of their recommendations for teaching elementary school students and really building them to become more effective writers. And there are 5 kind of general outlines for what we want to think about to support our writers. Is the opportunity to write every day, to teach the students about the writing process, the process of writing. Again, that there's a variety of purposes for writing, that we don't steer away from things like their handwriting and spelling, sentence construction, word processing skills, that we continue to work on those things, and that we give students a variety of high interest writing tasks, that we really mix it up a little bit for them. So as we think about those things and how that might look, if you're struggling with a student, when you think back and you step back and you look at your student and you find your student, you think, well, you know what, I think that this student is really struggling with ideas and getting ideas as their struggle. So if you have a student and you're thinking about engaging them in daily writing, which is kind of that, building stamina and getting the opportunity to write, some things you can think about when you're thinking about the student who's struggling with ideas. You might want to do some pre-writing or some brainstorming and free writing, and sometimes you might be the person holding the pen doing that. You might be the person who they're telling you what their thoughts are in their brainstorm, and getting them, getting some ideas down on paper for them, so that some of that harder things about getting the ideas and getting started on paper, that they might see something that you've done. Another way to give some ideas, you might choose a book that they've read. Sometimes an illustration might help, a really kind of pivotal illustration. If it's a content piece, it might be an illustration from something that they've read that had to do with content. Or if it's a narrative piece, it might be some really key illustration or some really interesting picture. If you look at the National Geographic for Kids, or if you look at any of those kind of, there are a lot of places, if you Google, you can see, interesting illustrations for students, or interesting pictures or thoughtful pictures for students. Make sure you include for students in your search, or for children, so that, they're appropriate for something that they would look at. But there's some things that might make a student wonder and really inspire their ideas for that. A lot of talk for discussions. In all of our previous sessions, we've had a lot of conversations about, the ability that you have when you sit with your small group, or you sit with, a student one-on-one, or you're nearby a student when you're working in a classroom to support them in a classroom session. You have the opportunity to sit and have discussions with students and talk. And sometimes talking through things and sharing their ideas orally with you and having a discussion might be another way to give them some ideas. Some models, so that teachers can show things that they might write about. There are a lot of graphic organizers, that students can jot ideas down on. Sometimes they keep lists and they can come back to them. You can write collaboratively. You might start, they might start, you might work together and be able to share the pen with them. Maybe they start off by telling you the beginning of the story, you start off writing it, and then they can keep going. And then sometimes sentence starters or framed paragraphs. I'm going to show you an example of a couple of those as we move forward, but there are many, many opportunities. Sometimes you just need to give them kind of a jumping off point. One thing that you want to be careful is not doing too much of it. Then you're going to be doing the lion's share of the work. And you want them to still be engaging in that writing. But for those students who are struggling with ideas, some of those things might get them started and get them going on paper. Another part that you might think of is if that daily writing for students who are really having trouble with their organization. Again, some guided writing, small focus lessons on one area at a time. Breaking the task down, the writing into smaller pieces that are more simple. Graphic organizers that might look like beginning or middle and end, so that they can have some ability to organize those things before they get going. Sometimes we have our students who don't have trouble getting pen to paper and getting a lot of information down there, but they might ramble on. They might not have a real clear focus. So thinking about some skills that might help them get things broken down into smaller pieces so that they can go forward and continue their writing, but start making some organizational changes. Motivation is a huge one. I think I've seen in the chat box some people talking about motivation. The idea of writing daily for a student who really doesn't love writing is certainly a challenge. And so think about some of these things when you think about things that might motivate your student who struggles with just not wanting to write. Really focusing on a varied purpose, task, and audience. What could this writing be about? It certainly does not always have to be a story. Many times students kind of disengage if they think they're having to write another story or write about a time that they've done something exciting. There might be a student who doesn't have a idea of something that they could write, or they feel threatened because whatever everybody else shares or whatever exciting thing that happens to other people, they don't feel like their experiences are as valuable or as meaningful. So the purpose might be for them that they're writing, how-to lists or things that they feel more successful on, observations. Varying the tasks and keeping it something new. And then again, keeping in mind the audience. Who might they be writing it for? They might be writing something to the principal, to another student, to an older student, to a grandparent, to a friend, to a newspaper. Even if it doesn't always, get back there, it certainly is something that they'll have an idea for, and it gives much more authenticity if it can get to one of those people, especially if one of the people that they're for their audience might write back, even if it's just to share it in a class book. Thinking about varying the mode and the content. Think about different types of writing. When we started at the beginning, writing things that were like a newspaper article, or writing a scientific log, writing definitions, something that's a little more formal structure, writing different how-to books, some things like that. Having small individual conferences with students, giving them real feedback in a constant format, so that they're not, a whole page into the task or 2 pages into a task when they're just feeling stuck, or they've already had organization things, or they feel like they've just worked on it, and you're going to come in, and do, kind of that whole thing. And they feel kind of defeated by that. So meet with them as often as you can and support them and give them feedback and celebrations on those small pieces, and do a lot of those small celebrations for the things that they've done well. Again, back to purpose and tasks, really making tasks relevant to the students. If you have a student who really likes trucks, or you have a student who is really engaged in hiking, or really engaged with their friends or families, or has a birthday coming up, writing tasks relevant to what's happening in their life. When we come back to school in the fall, I'm sure there will be a lot of thoughts and a lot of adjustments to things that have happened to students, and really thinking through some processing and some relevant information or experiences that students might have had, or just being back to school in those celebrations. When we talked back about vocabulary, we talked about a lot of background knowledge, really digging in and thinking about background knowledge and using that, again, what might be something that they really know a lot about. You're going to feel a lot more confident and motivated to write about something that you know a lot about. And then think about publishing the work, sharing it with a friend, sharing it with someone else, or even sharing the pen. Thinking about having them not have to do all of the physical act of writing, that they might need some support with another person doing some of the physical act of writing, and that they get to spend more ideas kind of on the idea part of it and more time in that, and it might lighten the physical load for them sometimes. So we think about the writing process. I know that, you know, we think about a number of years ago, we did, you know, kind of the traits of writing and 6+1, and we've done a lot of those things. Sometimes the writing process, when we think about, you know, a draft and a revision and in publishing and recopying, sometimes students who struggle might feel very overwhelmed by that, especially when a lot of times when they get to the end of a piece, they might be very quick to put it aside and be done with it. Certainly not willing to want to copy it over. And I think, you know, when I think about myself as a writer, you know, a lot of times, especially now when I think of, you know, word processing, they're really, you know, editing is something we do as we go along. It isn't something necessarily that we do entirely one time and then we copy it over again. So thinking about the writing process a little bit, kind of breaking it into a few parts. So we think about the planning. So those students that we talked about, thinking about a plan before they really get going. And that might not be a big, long written out plan. It might be a few, kind of a few ideas, a little blurb that is, you know, kind of a main idea, a focus. You might have some conversations with them, the 3 W's, you know, who, what, where questions, or why. It might start with them drawing a picture that they could then write about. But a plan, you know, just having an idea in their mind where they're going to go. It might not always go that way, but to give them some ideas. And sometimes having a plan and giving them kind of a structure. If just getting and starting in on a piece of paper is too overwhelming, a couple of acronyms that they refer to a little bit when we're talking about planning. TREE is one. If you're trying to get a student to write, you can kind of give them this as a, you know, kind of a chart, or you can jot it down for them. Tell me something you believe, 3 reasons why, you know, explain each reason, and then come up with an end. And that might give them a plan, a reflection, and you could even help them jot those things down if they were going to try to persuade somebody of something or tell about something that they really liked. And then the next acronym is POW, pick an idea, organize some notes, and then write about them. And again, those are 2 good places where the adult and you are there to kind of scaffold that for them and really begin them getting going in their plan in kind of a supportive way. You know, you kind of think of your role as kind of a tool to get them started off, and give them some choice and some independence. When they're thinking about kind of a draft, you want to make sure that you're not, you know, go ahead, write this whole piece and think of that as their draft. When we're thinking about writers who aren't really engaged and really don't really love writing, we're going to think about it in very short parts. You might want to just focus on for one aspect of the writing. You might want to give them a model for something. Again, share that pen, do some of the writing yourself, and don't attack the whole entire process. You know, keep it to short parts, choose a sentence, you know, choose a really strong topic sentence. What one might that look like? And really just dig into that. And that might carry over the next time that they're working, so that they might write a stronger sentence. And then, you know, you might be able to support them through that. So try not to think of a draft as this kind of just this piece that's going to be completely reconstructed when you're supporting them as a writer. And then give them an opportunity to share it and think about it. You know, not just to reread it. A lot of times students feel like if they're going to think about their draft, they just have to go back. Give them an opportunity to read it to you, read it into a recorder, read it with a peer, have some practice. If you're in a small group, have some time to practice giving feedback to each other if students feel safe doing that. Some students don't want to share their writing, which might be helpful that they're just sharing it with you, or they're just sharing it into a recording that they can listen to themselves. Some people feel kind of private about their writing. So when you're thinking about those drafts and that reflection of once they've got something in print, kind of what that next thing there is going to do with it. Keep the pieces that you're focusing on short. If you're thinking about, looking at it again, and then give them an opportunity to share it and have some conversation about it as they go along. And then have them, after they've had that time to share it with you or even with themselves, give them some time to evaluate that. Teach them to ask themselves some questions. If they're going to do it and listen to it in a recording, teach them to ask, just not all of these questions at one time, but have them reflect. Oh, did my writing make sense? This was a letter that was to the principal to ask for extra recess. Will he understand what I was thinking? Is he going to, or she is, they're going to understand everything that I had to say? And did I write it in an appropriate way for someone, whoever it was intended for? Have celebrations with the students and lots of conversation, share their feedback, and just encourage them to value themselves as writers. And then think about tools that will simplify when you come to revision and editing. Think about that planning and talking piece a lot before, and that you might use some tools that will simplify it. It might be reading their piece aloud into, there's a lot of technology that will type the words as they read them. So some schools have that access. And then there are a lot of tools, if you're especially on certain programs, that once it's typed in there, it'll read it back to you and they can listen to it. But choose small pieces when you're thinking about that revision and editing. Teach them about to celebrate their success, and then support them when it comes to that revision and editing. It might even be that they do it and then you might type it up into a piece where it looks published and that's, they've revised, they've changed something they're happy with, and you might be the person who helps them, quote unquote, publish that piece of writing so they're not feeling so overwhelmed with the idea of retyping or redoing everything again. Sometimes that just makes them not want to write too much because they know they're going to have to copy it over or retype it. So think about what tools you might have that might help them do that and make it a little less daunting for them. So one of the things that we talked about at the beginning was keeping the writing purpose varied. Another acronym to think about is RAFT. So the first thing you can talk to them about when you're thinking about kind of this part of writing is, the role of the writer. Who am I going to write to? Or, what might you be as the writer? So you've got an audience. Now think about who you could be writing as. Give them some variety there. Could you write a story as you were a pilgrim? Put yourself in somebody's place. Could you write as a soldier? Having somebody write as the president might be a little daunting right now. You might want to avoid that one currently, but it would certainly be an interesting perspective. Think about who you could be if you weren't writing as yourself. Pretend you were somebody else, and who might you be? So that might give them a varied way to write. They could write as somebody different. They could write as write it as if they were their mom. Write it as if they were their dad. How would their mom or dad write? A persuasive piece to the principal? Would they think that having extra recess would be important? Sometimes it's interesting what students have to say when they put themselves in somebody else's place. And again, back to thinking about who are we writing to? Is the audience going to be for your friends, for your teachers? Is it going to be published in a classroom newspaper? Is it going to be to the veterans home? What audience might that be for? And then what thing might you be writing? Are you writing a letter, a list, You could write a poem, a speech. Think about all the different formats of writing that we do. Everything we do from, in the run of the day, think about the things you do as an adult in writing. You probably all sit down and write a lot of just narrative stories, but we write lists, we write notes, we write letters, we write emails, we write, text messages. Think about what format, I'm thinking about mixing up the format there. And then think about, what is it you're writing about? What is that topic? Sometimes that main idea is what's really going to get them started. So what's the subject or the point of this writing? What are you trying to accomplish? Sometimes they can narrow that to one sentence and you can keep coming back to it in your conversation. So really giving them some varied, some purposes for that. And some other ideas for doing that, they might think about describing things. Really just stepping back, closing your eyes and having an image, or finding a picture. Really describe all of those things. They might describe a character. Really think about the depth of a character if you're connecting it to a story they've read, and think about how many things they know about that character. Or write in the perspective of the character if they're a little bit older. Nature and science observations are great. Sometimes you might, sometimes if you have a plant going in a classroom, or you just take a break. Sometimes you just take a break with a student. You might have a small group or just one student, and you're taking a break, and you might go outside, and you can think about things, that you observe. I know as spring started, we had a lot of conversations about the changes. What might you observe as changes in nature? You might go to a same place every day, in the fall. What might be some of those things that you notice? Pick a tree. How might that tree change? You might go once a week and really look at it and make some kind of a log or a journal of some observations of how that tree changed from the first day that we looked at it. We walked out, there were 10 bugs climbing on it, and then within a couple months, the leaves are going to be orange. It's not something that happens instantly. You could even take some pictures to go along with it, and write a piece over time to really make some observations about some natural things that they see. Think about writing some experiences or feelings. I'm sure when we come back to school, or as you work through the end of this summer, I'm sure students have lots of different feelings. And so thinking about some of the things that they have, that they have feeling how the difference between being in a classroom, things likely will be different. How does that feel to know that, your friend is further away from you, or that less kids can go out on the playground at a time, which are all things that could happen to them. So there might be some real interesting things that they can kind of contemplate and process through as they're feeling different things, and describing how that makes them feel. If we're thinking of writing purpose for narrating, diaries and journals, those are sometimes a little quicker and less threatening because they're kind of a self-audience. Eyewitness accounts, sometimes just watching kind of a National Geographic has a lot of quick 2-minute videos of like a lizard coming along and eating a spider, or something kind of, for some reason, kind of gross is usually attractive to students. But you might watch one of those 2-minute videos with no sound, and have them give an eyewitness account. If you were going to narrate this, if you were going to talk about this, what might you have said? What if you were the narrator and you were giving an eyewitness account, where you really needed to tell somebody what you saw, but they couldn't see the video? How could you really use details from that? Sometimes that's very engaging to kind of be the narrator of those things. Same thing with news or events. If you look at Newsela, News ELA, which is just NEWSELA altogether, they have news stories that they post there that are appropriate for students and written for students of different ages. So you might do that, and you might find one of those that they can reflect on and model those, or just, again, write short stories that they might be engaged in. So if they're writing to inform, We've talked about a lot of these. There's some other ideas for just a purpose for writing, summarizing, they've learned something new, how could they teach it to someone else? Things that we write a lot, directions, instructions, letters, reports, those things are kind of common and we write them a lot. And then sometimes students are really drawn into writing a purpose to persuade somebody. They might want to write an editorial to give their opinion on something, a review. They might write a book review. They might write a recipe review if you have time. I know sometimes students have life skills programs where they get to cook. They might want to cook something and then write the directions for how they cooked it, the preparation that they needed, the recipes that they used, and then maybe a review. You know, how did that taste? Did I like it? Was it not good? You know, they can write reviews on, you know, their cooking that they might have had at home, or a restaurant that they've been to, or the school lunch that day. So just giving them a lot of varied purpose to really keep them thinking about writing in multiple ways. And you never know what way is going to be the most interesting for them. So there's a lot of talk, and they did refer to cursive as a form of writing. One of the things that's most really important when it comes to writing, handwriting is important. Pencil grip, you want to really be watching for their pencil grip, and that they're writing their letters fluently. Formation tasks are kind of those things when you say, you know, if it's a letter, there's different, like handwriting without tears, and there are some different kind of cues that might help some of your students. There are a lot of them out there, but, you know, pull down long, up, bump the line, and go around might be a B. I know a lot of times in the lowercase e, a lot of, you know, younger students remind themselves to start in the middle by hit the ball and run the bases. And so those little thoughts and things that they might say to themselves to think about writing their letters fluently, because you really want to think about writing as writing the letters and not drawing the letters. When students start thinking about drawing letters in little pieces and bits, that means their letter writing isn't very fluent, and it really gets in the way of their writing. So you want to practice that writing those letters fluently. If a letter like a lowercase e, when you're printing it, doesn't have to be lifted off the paper. So if they're writing kind of the letter C and then crossing it in the middle, that's not a very fluent way to form that letter. And you want to spend some time practicing fluent writing, tracing the letters, you know, some motor movements, some large and small movements, some just diagonal. Think about the lines, the shapes that you make the most, or the line movements that you make the most when you're printing or writing. You know, pulling down, starting at the top, crossing over, and just making some of those large movements with their whole arm, and small movements for motor movements to practice those movements from left to right, top to bottom, you know, with their whole arm up and down, and with small movements on paper. Those are important skills to get to be natural and automated for them, so that it works more fluently when they're writing it, they're printing on paper. And when we think about keyboarding, it's something you really want to start early and make it fun. It is an important skill, and it takes a lot of practice. There are some apps that you can use. There are many free. These are just a few: Type a Balloon, Keyboarding Zoo, Animal Typing, that help them know where the keys are on a keyboard. And absolutely, Amanda, crossing the midline is crucial. That's that same thing, top to bottom with your whole arm, crossing from left to right with your whole arm, and getting them to move their hand across their body. Again, with those motor movements, because you want it to be fluent movements and not just these little bits and pieces. So be thinking, again, keyboarding, for some of your students, you know, that might be something that when handwriting is more difficult, they might move into that and think of it as a tool for how that might develop for them as when they're writing. But think about, you know, don't lose that kind of like all those foundational skills we talked about with reading and all of those pieces. Keep that idea also that handwriting and keyboarding fluency are also important parts of writing. Spelling, we talked about spelling in an earlier session. Interestingly, about 850 words, less than 1,000 actual words, actually make up about 80% of the words that our students write in elementary school. And so these are all things that we've talked about in those previous sessions that are going to help them as writers. These are, just thinking back, because spelling is going to help the writing be legible. So they're going to need to have that as a skill when they're working through. So those are things we talked about, those other grade span issues as we move along, and things that we want to keep foundationally. And so another real important part that there's a lot of work on, Natalie Wexler does a lot of work around writing. I called it writing power yesterday, but it's writing revolution. And she talks about constructing sentences being a real key to starting with our writers and really building them up. Long pieces are very hard for students to process through and develop, especially when we think about editing and revising and all of those things. So one of the things that's really strong, a really strong tool to use with writers, all writers, but it's really much easier and less stressful for them on their working memory, is to think of them and really doing some work with sentences. They're smaller, students can really dig into them and develop them, and that should carry over. And her name is Natalie Wexler. She wrote Writing Revolution. And so when she talks about it, she talks a lot about keeping those little pieces into small components. So here's some of the things that you might do with sentences that might be really helpful for your students so that they can really think about it in smaller pieces. So one thing that we talk about is sentence frames. These are a little bit like a Mad Lib, only a Mad Lib tells you a little bit, put in an adverb. Mad Libs are fun. Students love them. They're great for parts of speech. But they're, as you work through them, and they're fun and they're silly. But a frame is another way to do it. And these, in a small group, they're fun and interesting to share. You might, this first one, I like dogs and goats. My dog is brown. And they can really, that's kind of the most simple. You can give them an example and then take out some keywords and see what they might fill in. She talks about, Natalie Wexler, that I referred to before, talks about because, and, but sentences. So she talks about, kind of using that. So pizza is disgusting because I don't like cheese and I don't like sauce, but I love sandwiches. And so you're giving them, it doesn't have to just be one word. They can develop them, but giving them some frames for how they might get going. So it's a little bit different than a sentence starter, because it's not just the start of the, a sentence that leads into a whole essay or a whole, informational piece. You're really just developing some frames and really giving them some ability to write through this. Another thing that this allows you to do is it allows you to have some conversations about what would make sense there. Because, if you're thinking about, word choice and grammar, there are some things that, you could use, I like could be a noun could go there, but a verb could be there. I like running. But there are some, parts of speech. So rereading these sentence frames and thinking when they choose words, whether they would still make sense and what that might look like. Another thing you can do with sentences is sentence expanding. A lot of times students, when they might have a little piece, remember we talked about when they've written something or they're reading something and you're going to work with it to just use a little piece and how one sentence in a piece that they've written might be expanded, and not trying to do this with the whole text. And you can practice this by just starting with a very short sentence. I just used the dog napped, and then just keep adding to it. Sometimes this is a lot of fun for students, especially if you're doing the writing, and it's a shared writing piece because they can see it happen. And it's amazing how much more extensive their sentences might be if you're the one doing the writing, but you're showing them how this can really expand their writing. So if they're writing a piece and their story said, the dog napped, there's a big difference between that and the big lazy brown dog napped on the couch while I read a book. So, you know, it really is, it's going to, you're going to look at those, you can look at those examples when you're, you know, doing a read aloud, and really think about how authors expand sentences to bring more description. And we talked earlier when we were talking about, in another session, we were talking about comprehension, we were talking about forming an image in your mind. And this would be a good time to expand on that and saying to the student, you know, what is your image of the dog napped? What picture do you have in your mind of that versus, you know, what picture do you have in your mind compared to the big lazy brown dog napped while I read a book, or on the couch while I read a book. So it's going to give them a much more in-depth picture in their mind as they go through. And a little kind of the opposite of that, or a little bit of a more extension of that. One thing that we see sometimes with beginning writers is they have a lot of sentences, a lot of periods, and a way to practice that as you move through is sentence combining. A lot of, you know, our writers, especially, you know, the younger writers, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, they have lots of little short sentences. You know, the boy was small, or, you know, all of those things. I like dogs, I like cats, I like pizza, all of these things when they're really short sentences. So you can show them some really short sentences. These don't have to be the short sentences, don't have to be ones that they write. It can be sentences that you give to them, and then you can work together to combine them into a sentence that really digs a lot more into the language and how that might extend their thinking and what they can do with those things. So, you know, instead of those 4 short sentences, which you could come up with and give to them, you know, because especially if you think of some of your readers and writers who struggle a little bit more, they might really appreciate those real short sentences because they could get them and read them through and clearly be successful with them, and then think about combining them into making a sentence that's much more interesting and clear, but still says the same thing. So you could do this combining and really think about how that might bring them into their writing, and think about the model that creates. So that's a great activity to do with students to try to get them into kind of that next level. Mentor sentences, down at the bottom, I've written a couple of resources that have some access to mentor sentences. Jeff Anderson, he calls himself the Write Guide, W-R-I-T-E, not R-I-G-H-T. And then the literacy effect. So mentor sentences can do so many things. You can choose a really interesting thing out of a story that a student has read, or a story that they've written. This one happens to be out of Uglies, and the author said the early summer sky was the color of cat vomit. Kids like really gross things. And so one thing you can do with mentor sentences is you can look at, you know, how might the author have written that? What does that sentence mean? You know, let's rewrite that. What does that sentence even mean? And really think and talk through how they might rewrite that sentence with what they understand it to be. You know, you can see that it basically means that the summer sky is ugly, or the summer sky, you know, what might that be if they were going to not call it cat vomit, if they were going to call it in colors. Mentor sentences, if you look at, you know, further into mentor sentences, you can look at grammar of the sentences, you can look at word choice, the vocabulary, back to when we talked about vocabulary, you can pull some interesting vocabulary out of that. And sometimes students, we talked a little bit about revision and editing. Some students who really aren't thrilled about the idea of writing, or writing is hard for them, they're a little sensitive to having things you know, taken apart. And the other thing that happens is, you know, if you're trying to teach grammar, years ago, I used to do things, we used to do sentences that had mistakes in them already, you know, and they were, you know, required, you know, you found those mistakes, and the students knew the mistakes were there and they could do that. But using a sentence that is correct and then thinking about how they can change it and edit it gives them an idea of how they can change and edit their own writing. You know, the author chose this as a sentence. It's a great sentence. It's very descriptive, but there are other options for that. And sometimes seeing what an author does and giving them the ability to use a mentor sentence and think how they could change it gives them that self-confidence to do that in their own writing and think about what that might be. And then another task, another activity that really gets kids thinking is generative sentences. And again, this is for students who are a little older. Read, Write, Think has a lot of examples of this on how to use it with vocabulary and how to use it, in content areas. But so and again, this connects well to your vocabulary. So, they might give them the direction to use the word hunch as the fourth word in a sentence. And, so they've got to know what hunch is. And then they've also got to think about how they can get that into place and how they can do those things. And again, you're only working with one sentence. And so you can talk about it, they can write it, you can give them a model, and they, if you start with, I had a hunch, they're probably going to start with, I had a hunch. But you can develop that and practice it, and then they can add to it. Add a because to the end of that. I had a hunch that today was going to be hot because, and again, ways to expand sentences in those small steps that they can feel confident and comfortable in, that can carry over into their own writing. And then kind of just finally thinking about keeping those their tasks either into high interest. Think about things that you can do as an adult to really keep their interest sparked. Sometimes it's really hard, but if you can write mentor sentences and write with them, so sharing the pen is you writing their ideas down, but sometimes you could write something and share it with them. If your dog got sprayed by a skunk right now, you might write a quick thing of that. You don't even have to always be true. You could write it down and just say to them, oh, this terrible thing happened to my dog last night. I had to write it down so I didn't forget, and share it with them. So they can see you writing as an adult. And as hard as that is to share that, it certainly engages them. Again, thinking aloud, we talked about that when we were talking about reading aloud and vocabulary, but sometimes having conversations that will spark their writing. Connecting giving them hands-on learning, connecting their writing to what they know a lot about. Those are going to keep their interest up. Allow students to write together. You might not always be the person who's holding the pen. It might be two students holding the pen together. So sometimes you might let them write something together and take turns writing that piece together, just as kind of another way to keep them engaged. Again, keep the idea of the task, the audience, and the purpose at the forefront, and give them lots of feedback. Just, don't let it get all the way to the end of a piece. You have the opportunity to be right close with your students and, give them that feedback as frequently as you can, so that they're not feeling lost in the writing and frustrated before it gets too far into the piece. So those are just kind of some things to think about overall. I liked this little person here, and I thought it was funny that this is an E.B. White quote, obviously. And I don't know what he wrote it in, but he did quote it. There's a quote from him that writing is an act of faith, not a trick of grammar. And I think that sometimes, students think that writing is a trick and a chore. And, as much as we can, we really want to think of it as ways that we can engage them, because the more stamina they have and the more opportunity they have to do it, the better that they are going to become. So I just want to say thank you so much. Here is the bit.ly link, and let me hit escape on this so that I can throw that bit.ly link also in the chat box, because I know sometimes people can get it easier out of that. I do think I have it right this time as far as everybody who has the link can do it. And so the QR code, I obviously will leave that up there for a bit to make it a little bit bigger. Make that bigger in case people are trying to get it on their phones. I have it on another screen too, so I can see that it's big enough. My email is there. If you have any follow-up questions or anything else you have thoughts about, please feel free to email me. And thank you so much for all of you who have participated in all, across the sessions. I have everybody's email. That's how I send out the reminders. Interestingly, just out of just for an interesting fact, there have been 600 people who have participated either in recordings or live sessions. The email list that I have gathered for people who've registered is 600 people. So thank you very much for your participation.